Hello everyone. Today we're going to be making this knotty wood. It's like a wood with knots in it. And I thought it'd be fun to, we can adjust the knots, we can make it a little bit rougher. We can also, change their location on the X and the Y. And in so doing, we can customize this wood. I think it looks cool on a cylinder. We can also see what it looks like on a cube. And I've got this tiled twice, so I've got the tiling set to 2. And we've got several things going on here. We've got the background wood, and then we've got the knots, and then we've got this area around the knots. And then on the X value, you'll notice also that wherever there are knots, that area on the X is going to be rougher. So we've got a bunch of different things going on here, and without further ado, let's get into Substance and start building it. All right, so we're back in Substance, and this is what it looks like in the Substance renderer. And this is my test material that I built, and you'll notice that the vast majority of what's going on is going on in these grayscale maps. And this material really is all about the grayscale because it's relying entirely on gradient maps for its color. And one thing I wanted to point out, this is like a really good example of not always needing to have everything constantly at parent size. The parent size here I've set at 2K, and you'll notice that these knots are all set in at 512. They're all parent size -2. This one I upped a little bit because this is the noise for these, like the little, I guess, splintery bits of the wood. It's not entirely smooth, so I set this in. But again, we didn't need this at 2K. So all of these grayscale maps are all less than parent size. And as things exit out of this low res area, if that's what you want to call it, that's when they get scaled up. So, we choose a common node at the end of this, and this one here is set at parent. So this allows us to be much more efficient with our materials. If we're doing masks, very rarely do you need a mask at full res because it's usually blocking something out. My color up here, I want my color at 2K. It's at parent because I want the details of the color. But if you think about it, all of these wishy-washy gradient type things that we base our gradient maps on, there's absolutely no need for it to be at full res. And you will make your material far, far more efficient if you can sort of designate sections and say, okay, well, I only need this section at a low res. And, the amount of processing you save is great. So I just wanted to mention that sort of as a general thing. And we're now going to commence to actually building our material. We're going to start right here with these knots because that's the trickiest bit of all of this. And it's also going to have our input parameters in here. We're going to stick them on these transform 2D nodes here. And we have 2 input parameters. We have our knot size, which is a float 2, and our knot location, which is a float 4. And we'll get to those shortly. So without further ado, let's make a new substance. And we'll call it Knotty Wood. And we'll use the PBR metallic template. And I've set in my parent size here at 2K. I think by default, I know by default it's at 512. All this number means is what you want your default parent size to be set. It saves you having to come back up in here and change it is all it really does. So it's not important. It doesn't really matter. I will be adding an ambient occlusion, so I'm going to duplicate that base color. I'm going to put it on top there, and I'm going to change its assignment, and I'm going to change its labels. So that's all squared away. Oh, the other thing I want to do is my preference of having my height next to my normal. All right, so let's commence to building our material. I'm going to come into the library. I'm going to get a couple of things. I'm going to get a shape node, and I'm going to set that to a bell shape, which gives me this nice sort of gradient. It's a nice circular gradient. You can pick another shape if you want. You know, this isn't really terribly important. But what I am going to do is I'm going to set this down to parent -2. And that's going to set this, you know, assuming we have the parent size at 2K, that's going to make this 512 by 512. The next thing I'm going to grab out of the library is a Perlin noise. And I'm going to do the same thing to it as far as, you know, its resolution. I'm also going to make it bigger. Well, I mean, I'm going to make the things bigger. That means the scale is smaller, about like that. Because we're going to start warping things against this. And then finally, I'm going to get a Gaussian noise. And again, I'm going to set this down to big. Now you'll notice that what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to set these things up to be as efficient processing-wise as possible. And that includes bringing this down by 2 as well. And with things like the Perlin noise and the Gaussian noise, as you bring the scale down, it takes less and less processing. So as I make it finer in this Gaussian noise, the higher this number gets. So what I'm doing now is I'm setting these things up for the largest version of what I'm going to need it at. And if I need to make it smaller, I'm going to use a transform 2D to shrink it down, because it's not asking this more complicated node that's doing a lot of computations to do the work. I'm just simply tiling it up. And again, as far as processing goes, it's going to take a lot less energy. So these are the 3 basic nodes with which we're going to start building our material. And we're going to start by building our knots. To do that, I'm going to need a gradient, and I'm going to take this round bell shape, and we're going to make this the sort of nub of how we're going to be doing our knot. So I've clicked on my gradient map, I'm going into gradient editor, and I'm going to now make a grayscale for the knot itself. So, you know, it's basically concentric rings, right? So I'm just going to click on here a bunch of times. I'm going to click on here a bunch of times. And I'm going to get myself a selection of points. I think I probably want to... I'm trying to think of how many rings I want here. I don't think I want it too dense. So I'm going to click a couple more times. I think that will probably do us. We can always make it finer if we want. And then I'm going to start taking these guys and just interspacing them in between. So we're starting to get these concentric rings. And the more points you put in here, obviously, the finer your rings are going to get. And the closer you bring them together, the sharper that line becomes, because you're talking about gradients here. So, you know, do those to taste. But I'm going to leave it like this for now, because I kind of want to make my cartoony wood. I like cartoony. The other thing I want to do to this gradient map is I want to change it to a grayscale, because I'm not going to use it as a color. And we're just going to make it grayscale, and that's done. Now, this doesn't look anything like a tree. I mean, it's got the basic, you know, pattern that we want, but we're going to have to start doing things to it. And the things we're going to start doing to it involve warp nodes. I'm going to plug it in here. Now, the first thing I want to address is the straightness of these lines. I mean, this looks like a mechanical shape. This does not look like a natural shape. So I kind of want to make it just not quite so perfect. I'm not worried about having it look like a knot yet. I'm just worried about having this be not perfect. So I want to use this Perlin noise, but I want to get it a lot finer. And like I said before, I don't want to have to adjust the Perlin. I'm going to get a transform 2D node, and I'm just going to tile it up a bit. So I'm just going to divide it by half, and that's just going to make the pattern half as big. And then we can plug it in here and bring this down until, you know, it stops looking like a like perfect circles. Now, as far as knots go, as far as tree knots go, this is, this is still looking very round and weird. But if you look at the individual rings, they're starting to look a little bit more organic as opposed to like the mechanical shape that you actually get from this perfect sphere. And we're going to get another warp node. So we've got that finer stuff done, and now we're going to start looking at the bigger picture. And for that, I want a bigger warp. So I'm going to go back to my original larger Perlin noise and warp it a bit more on that warp. Still a bit much, but yeah, so it's starting to look a little bit more funky. It's still perfectly round, but what's going on within this perfectly round area is starting to do really organic things. It's if anything, it's looking like a flower right now, because flowers are perfectly round, but they've still got like this stuff going on in it's still not perfect. So we're moving away from the round now. And we're going to add another warp node. And we're going to warp it again. And this time, I'm going for the outside shape. And for that, I'm going to come into this large Gaussian noise that I have and warp it with that. Except now I want to actually go higher. I'm going to start high and work down, because it's going to give, it opens up that slider for me. I know I'm not going to need 50. All right, so that's kind of looking more like the shape I want. And I'm debating, I think, well, I don't want anything on the outside there. Because I'm looking at these gray, there was like, if you bring it out too much, it starts splitting the shape up. So, if that's what you want, do it. If you want like crazy knots and you want to put knots on top of knots, just be careful that you don't come up to these edges, because in a couple of steps, we're going to have to turn this into a no tile image. Right now, because it's tiling, it's coming over the edges like this. So you can get this as rough as you want it to be, as long as you stay away from the edges. I want it an integral shape, so I'm going to keep sliding this down until it's all one piece, like that. I think I might add another ring or two in here as well. Yeah, it was just, I was looking a little lonely. And you can move them around too. So I'm gonna actually let's keep this one highlighted. I'm gonna single click on my gradient editor, and I'm not gonna be adding anything, so I can just use the thing down here. I'm not entirely happy with this section in here. I want to see whether I can do something about that. Yeah, if you double click on them, which I just did by accident, it will open up the gradient editor. So I think what I want to do is add another ring right in here. There. That's the ticket. That's what I want. Because I didn't like that big white open area. I wanted it kind of more filled in. Now I'm happy with it. So we have this basic shape. And the final thing I want to put in here, I'm going to get a blur, high quality blur grayscale. And I just want to blur it just a tad, to take some of the roughness off of what those warps put in there. Because whenever you warp stuff, it does pixelate it quite a bit. So you see how you get like these, you get like these little grid lines and it gets rough. So I'm just going to, just a tad, just give it a warp. Just give it a blur. So you can see it kind of smooths it out a bit. Like right here, you can see that. It's just artifacting that I haven't figured out how to make warps not do it. And we are at 512 too, so it's pretty grainy to begin with. But I think that's pretty good. So I have it set like 0.86 or something small. And finally, we're going to get a transform 2D node. And the purpose of this transform 2D node is twofold. First of all, we're going to make this stop tiling, because what we need to do is make it smaller. We're going to bring the size down to something that will fit onto our material, because right now it's taking up the entire space. It's taking up the entire UV space. So we're going to set this to no tiling, and I'm holding down the control key and I'm going to resize it. Oh, shift and control, sorry. And we're going to resize it down to something that's going to work for us. So right now I'm looking for what is the absolute maximum size that I want one of my knots to be on my material. It's not going to be that big because, you know, you've still got wood going on here and you're going to have a second one of them as well. So I wouldn't go much bigger than this. And because we've set it to no tiling, we're only getting one of them. And this then becomes our, you know, basic knot form. And it's this basic knot form that we're now going to start messing around with to get it to look like two different knots. And as you would expect, that's going to involve a warp node. I'm going to build this once. We're going to have two different versions, but you know, the idea behind them is going to be the same. So we're going to build one chain and then we'll just copy it out and do another one. So we're going to plug this in here and we're going to take this and we're going to warp it against something. What we're going to warp it against is this very same Gaussian noise, but I'm going to do each one of them differently. And I can do that by, you know, moving this noise around. If I get the transform 2D node, let's bring this warp up. I don't think it's warping enough. So let's see what happens if we bring the intensity up to 10. That's too much. Maybe something like that. And then if I single click on that transform 2D, as I move it around, it's going to change that shape. And I'm just going to move it around until I find something I like. I like that. And then I want a levels node because I kind of want to bump it up a little bit as far as, well, bump it up. I want to bring the whites up a little bit, get a little bit more contrasty. So I have some nice high areas right here. I don't want too much gray. What it's going to do in the normals, it's going to kind of flatten it out a little bit in those white areas. So, you know, you can just adjust it according to how you want that normal to look. And I'm going to grab another HQ blur and we'll plug that in there. And again, this is really to counteract that warp we just put on it. You know, I'm not worried about it too much because it's, you know, it's a rough knot, but if you leave it too rough, the way that it's rough is very noisy and it starts looking like noise after a while. So it's a question of just controlling what it does because I haven't figured out a way of getting it to not do that. So that's the basic thing, and we're just going to repeat this out. And we can highlight this one now and just make it a new shape. We've got this shape and then we've got this shape. So, you know, they're different enough, but they're also similar, which is exactly what knots are. Now we are getting to the point where we're going to have to start putting our input parameters because in our material, you know, in the sample material that I made, I had two input parameters. I had one that dealt with the size, and then I had another one that dealt with the location. And we're going to have to actually deal with them in two separate transform nodes. And it'll just be easier to show you as I do it, but we're going to have to split it up. But let's make our input parameters first. So I'm coming in here, I'm going to create a new input parameter, and we're going to call this one knot size. And we're going to have a single slider per knot. So I want to put them both on this same input. So I'm going to turn this into a float 2, and then we'll split them up with the Swizzle once we get into actually making the functions. So we'll call this size knot. We don't need size. We'll just put knot 1 and knot 2 for the Y. And those will be the labels. The next thing we're going to make is our knot location. And again, I want to put them both on the same input, and we're going to have an X and Y for each one of them. So that's going to want to be a float 4. So we'll have knot 1 X, knot 1 Y, and that's the labels done. So each one of these is going to correspond, and again, we'll swizzle them out when it comes time to make this stuff. Now, let's get a transform and take a look at the size and moving around. So here we are, and I'm just going to do this manually right now just to demonstrate. So, I can size this up and down how I want, and eventually we're going to make it a function, and it can be sized by function. But what happens when I start moving it around? It's not tiling. And that's because it's getting its tiling information from here. We set this as no tile, and it continues to get its input from the previous node. So that no tile is coming down the chain. And for sizing purposes, that's exactly what we want, because we still don't want to have a whole bunch of them here, but we can't move it. So that's why we have to split this up into two sections, because we're going to size it with a no tile, and then we're going to put in another transform 2D, and we will allow it to tile, and that's going to let it move around. I'm going to get rid of this because I don't know what I did to it. We're going to get another transform, and now we can come in to the size and put a function on there since we have our variables. So I'm going to come into my transform matrix. I'm going to click here, empty function. I'm going to click on the little graph, and we're in the function graph. Okay, so it's expecting a float 4 because this is, that float 4 matrix for your transform 2D. And if you haven't done this, I do have videos on it. I will post a link to it because I'm not going to go over that information here. We're going to want a couple of float 2s. We're going to want a float 4 because we need to vector these numbers down into, we have to like ratchet it down into this float 4. We're also going to need a 0 because remember the pattern we have in that float 4, our normal state is 1, 0, 0, 1. So the first number is going to be our variable, then we're going to have 0 and 0, and our last number is going to be that variable. And that is what is going to tile that image in this transform 2D. Like I said, if you haven't seen this before, I will post a link. This is something I do all the time, and I just don't want to explain it all over again from the beginning. Right, so what we need now is our variable, and we're going to get our size, and we had that as a float 2 because we had one size per each. So we're going to be getting that float 2. I'm going to click on it, and that's going to bring not size into my dropdown. But we're only dealing with not 1 right now. So that means I'm going to have to swizzle out that value because we only want one of those values. And we want a swizzle float 1. So what that means is I'm taking this float 2 value and I want to swizzle out, well, in this case I do actually want the x, but it gives you a drop-down list of which single value do you want to swizzle out of that float 2. Well, let's take a look and see what happens if we do it this way, just to demonstrate, because this is not going to be the final answer, and you'll see why in a minute. We're going to set that float 4 as our output node, and let's come back in here. So I've got this double-clicked. I'm going to double-click on my graph so I can see my actual input parameters in here. So we're talking about not size 1, so that's my first default one here. So as I bring this number down, it's getting bigger. That's the exact opposite of what I want. And that's because this transform matrix on the transform 2D node is dealing with tiling. So it says right now it's tiled at 1. If I bring the number down, it's half, let's say if I bring it down to 0.5, it's tiled at half, which actually makes it bigger. Let me just come back to the result so we can see what's going on in here. What we actually have to do is reverse the direction in which our slider is going. And that's pretty easy. I'm going to get the number 1, and I'm going to get a subtraction, and I'm going to subtract whatever this number is from the number 1. And this works because this number on our input parameter is a number that goes between 0 and 1, and that's why this works, because it's just going to invert it. So if we come back in here, and now we've inverted the direction, as I make it smaller, it gets smaller. As I make it bigger, it gets bigger. We're having other problems here because it's getting too big. So the next thing we're going to want to do is to limit the size. I want to decide what is the absolute smallest I want to see this knot at. Let's call, let's make it simple. Let's make it -1. 1 is too big. What's my original size? All right, so let's call it 0.25 and -1. So we don't want it any bigger than 0.25, and we don't want it any smaller than -1. Right, so we're not talking about the negated number. We're talking about what's going on the slider. So that's this right here. So whatever we have to put in here as far as limiting it, we're going to do before it reaches this negation. So if this number is smaller than -1, then -1, because I don't want to get smaller, so it's just going to stick there. Otherwise, this number. So it's come out of here. So if it's smaller than -1, it's -1. It's coming out. That number will not be greater than 0.25. But if it was this original number, now it's going through its second test. So now we're testing, is this number greater than 0.25? If so, then I want 0.25. Otherwise, I want this result. And that is what we're going to stick in here. So whatever is going on here will then get negated. So let's take another look and see what happens to our result here. And I'm going to clamp this. So the default I want to be -1 for my minimum is -1, and my maximum will be 0.25. So it's getting, so it's not going to let me go below -1. Well, actually, I don't even need to clamp this, because as I go below, it's not changing anything. And for aesthetic reasons, I would clamp it, but you've clamped it in the function as well. And then it won't go above 0.25. So that's the sizing done. And all we need to do is duplicate this out and use it for the other one, except we need to change the value that we're swizzling out. So I'm going to come back into this transform matrix. I'm going to go into this swizzle node. And instead of swizzling out the X, we're going to swizzle out the Y. So that's the sizing done. Now, I'm going to get another transform 2D node, but this time we're going to let it tile. So I have to come back into here, and my tiling mode, I am now going to make absolute, and I'm going to have it tile on both the horizontal and the vertical. And now we're not having that problem that we were having with the other one. And this one's pretty straightforward. We're just going to go right to the offset of our transform 2D. We're going to hit empty function, and we're going to take a look at our input parameters and our not location. We had the X and the Y, so we're going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to use a swizzle, and we're going to swizzle out those first two values. So I'm going to come into the node. I've got my offset. I'm going to click on that graph. We're going to need our variable float4, which is our not location. We're going to get a swizzle float2. We're going to come into the swizzle float2, and in this particular case, we are going to want the X and the Y because they do actually correspond to not one X and not one Y. We turn this into our output node, and we can come back and test it using our input parameters. And there we go. It's moving on the X and it's moving on the Y. And if I move these guys around, it does absolutely nothing. So now we just duplicate this guy out, and we hook it up to knot number 2. We come back into our graph. I just want to make sure I'm on the right one. Yeah, okay. I'm going to come back into our graph, and our swizzle now, instead of swizzling out the X and the Y, we're going to swizzle out the Z and the W. And if we come back into our input parameters and look at them in here, we will now see that these guys control this one, and these guys control that one. And so we don't have to do that again. Why don't we just go ahead and combine them so that they're now coming out of a single node using blend, and we're going to use lighten, and now we get to see both of them on the same node. Let's move this back. And that is sort of the basic bit done. So the only thing we have left to do now is to create a mask that we can use for these knots, because we're going to be laying them over on top of all the other stuff that we're building, and we need a way to sort of, cut them out. We're going to use a levels node. See, we might need to blur it out ahead. Probably not. Let's take a look. I'm going to try to get rid of all the stuff that's going on inside that knot. I'm also going to try to not have that. That's pretty good. So this is giving me this edge right here. But I'm also going to need to kind of raise it up above, it's the thing that's kind of popping out the most. And I'm going to use a bevel node to make that happen. I'm not going to be using the normal out of here, even though it makes its own normal node. Even though it makes its own normal channel, rather. I'm only going to be using the gradient because as I did some experimentation, it turned out better that way. It just lets me not have this up quite so high, because this will let me bring this down to parent -2. So we can keep with that whole 512 thing. And then I make my normals off of the gradient that's getting produced out of the height map here. I'm not worrying about this normal. With this levels node, we've created the outline of, the perimeter of what we've made as far as the details. And that's what we're going to plug into this bevel node. And what this will do is it'll give us a gradient that'll kind of not be like this sharp edge, but more like a little knot. It's not be quite that big. But you'll see that, we can actually, once we start applying color in here, it gives us a bit of a gradient. It's a good thing to have. Probably more like that. But you'll also see that it's very rough. Let's see how much we can take care of in here, because this will let us smooth it. So let's smooth, yeah, that's better. Let's smooth this up a little bit. That looks a little nicer. But we're also going to need a second mask that's going to cover the outside edge of this bevel, because this levels, oh, you know what, I brought this down too much, that's why they're not. If we look at this edge, why is it still, oh, because I thought I was doing it off of parent. Okay, that was my mistake. I thought I had it set to relative to parent. It wasn't. It was doing it off of input. What I just ended up doing here was like taking this input and just like ramping it down, which is why it wasn't matching up. Now it's the same. Because what happens if you click on this one and you click on this one, they should be exactly in the same spot. This is bigger. There's more area to it. This is only dealing with the design. But we're taking this design and we're putting it on top of this larger area. So we're going to actually need to make another mask for this larger area. I'm going to get a blur, and then I'm going to get a levels node. And a good way to make this adjustment is I'm going to also make this temporary blend, and I'm just going to bring down this opacity. This blur I want very low. I'm just getting a bit more white into this gray. Is what I'm doing. I'm going to double click on the blend here. I'm going to single click on this levels node, and I'm going to try to get this white out to the edges of my bevel. And this lets me see both of them at the same time. So that's covering the entire thing, including that bevel. All right, we can get rid of this. We don't need that. Okay, so here we are. We've got the knots themselves done. And the next thing we're going to do is up in here, we are going to build the kind of that first ring of roughness around the knot. It's not the knot itself, but it's kind of got its own little ring system. Right. So the principle here is going to be pretty much exactly the same. We're going to take shapes and just warp them. I am going to get this same bell shape. And now, since I'm kind of going for that oblong oval that surrounds the knot itself, so I'm holding down the control key so it does it off the center, and I'm going to get a shape that I like. But again, what's happening here is that it's tiling the shape, and I don't want that. I just want it to correspond to this knot. So we're going to do, you know, we're going to repeat it out. We're going to have one for each of these. So each of them is going to be centered just like this knot is centered. So what we also need to have happen, just like this guy, is to have it not tile. So now they're corresponding. And again, anytime we want to check how they work with each other, we can kind of do a temporary thing where we just overlay one on top of the other, whether we do it, you know, with the opacity or whatnot. But it's a good way of seeing how they work with each other, because they're all going to be hooked up to the same function. So they're all going to, if they start out the same, they're going to end up the same. So this fits pretty good. I'm kind of happy with how that goes. You know, it's laying on top. It's just like this one, you know, just like the knot started out, it's kind of perfectly even, which we're going to deal with in a minute. But as far as the general size, I'm pretty happy with it. Maybe I wanted a little bit, maybe around it like that. Make it a little bit longer. That's pretty good. Again, it's important that it not reach the edges, because if we do, it's not a tiled texture. It'll give us a line. We don't want that. And then we're going to start pulling out the warp nodes. This one's going to get warped a little bit less. I'm going to take that. We're going to warp it. Now, I wanted to warp exactly how this is warping. So we're going to be starting with knot 1. Let's move that back. This blend node is absolutely unnecessary. So what's happening, we're starting to repeat this more or less. So I think what I'm actually going to do, well, it doesn't matter. I'm going to take this and I'm going to warp it against, what's important is that it gets warped against the same thing, because this is matching this and then this is going to match this. Now I can warp it by a greater amount if I want, or a lesser amount. And we can kind of start looking at that a little bit more when we do our colors. And again, if I want to see what that looks like temporarily, I can. Ah, wrong thing. So I can, you know, I'm imagining the gradient map that this is going to make. So I kind of like that. All right, so that's for the first one. And then we can get another warp node. And we'll take the same shape, only this time we're warping it against the second one, and we're seeing how it looks. Actually, they're both centered the same. It doesn't matter. We're seeing how it looks with the second one, though. So let's put this in here. So maybe like that. Just want to make sure it doesn't go to the edge. So those are our 2 warps. Now, we're not going to need to get this levels and all this stuff in, because this is going to be just for our gradient. As far as, the wood rings gradient. We're going to make it just like we would make any wood ring, which is we take a gradient and then we apply rings to it using a gradient map. But what I do want to have exactly the same is this stuff in here. I'm going to duplicate this. And these transforms are going to have exactly the same transforms happen to these ovals that we have happen to the knots themselves. So this is the first one, this is the second one. And this is going to size and move according to whatever the input parameters are, because it's getting the exact same functions applied to it. So if they start in the same place and we do the same things to them, they're going to end up in the same place. And just like the other one, we're going to blend it using a lighten blend. And I'm seeing a line in here, and that's to do most likely with the fact that this is too warpy. We need to, then we're going to have to bring the size of this down. I'm holding down the control key to do it from the center. Thought I was. Yeah, and that's why it's important to not have them touch the edges, because it only works if they don't. All right, that looks better. The next thing I want to see happen is, I don't want it quite so smooth. So I'm going to get another transform 2D, and I'm going to take that noise there, and then I'm going to fool around with it. I think I want it smaller. Probably good. And, you know, I'm going to get a second transform to do this, just in case I don't like the size, so I can get rid of one of them. Although it's probably unnecessary. I'm gonna risk it. I'm just gonna do it on one. I want to get it squishier. That's not where I wanted to put it either. I want to get a warp node. I want to take the results of this, and I want to warp it against that noise, because I don't want them quite that smooth. So I want it to be more splintery, which is why I'm going to bring this down. So I'm going to get this squishier, probably like that, and a lot less warpy. But just so it's, I guess more splintery really is the word I would use for it. I think maybe let's see what happens if we put a levels node in here and get it more contrasty. We'll adjust it further when we start looking at the color, but this is to break things up a little bit. And let's get a blur to maybe smooth that warp out a little bit. Again, a pretty low amount. I'm going to get a levels node. All of this stuff right here is aesthetics. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a mask for how I want that super rough area to blend in with the smoother wood underneath. So I want the edges to have a bit of a frayed look to them. I'm really not liking where this is going. Let's start from the beginning. So I want there to be, you know, like the center to be full white, but then I don't want the edges to be too even. Probably like that. And then finally, I'm going to get a directional blur, and I want to see it pretty high number. I think to start that's fine. We're going to have to see how it looks exactly when we start doing the colors. But that's basically it as far as the things, you know, that second group of rings that goes directly underneath the actual knot. And then finally, we have one very simple gradient to make, which is the background, just the overall sort of striations that go on in the background. And again, you can use whatever you want. There's the key is that it's a gradient, because once you have a gradient, you can assign rings to it. And I ended up using, I think, this one. I like this one because it's giving me, you know, it's got a nice shallow gradient here, so I don't have a lot of pure black or I don't have a lot of pure white, and it's giving me a lot of variations that I can play with here. But again, you can use whatever you want. The other thing I'm going to get is directional noise, and I think I got directional noise 1. And this is going to be the very simple background. This one, I had it down parent -1 instead of parent -2, because I do want to use, I do want it to have a certain amount of size, because we are going to be getting some actual normal information from here, whereas this gradient, we can have it at, again, at -2, because it does not have to be exact. So that can be at 512, and then this one I want at 1K. I'm going to get a levels node. Let's leave that for now. We're not going to deal with this one right now. Let's do this first. I'm going to get another warp, of course, and I'm going to take this gradient and I'm going to warp it against this big purlin right here. And I'm going to pull this out into its own separate section. This warp right here, we're going to get how we like once we get which is why I didn't do this. We're going to get this how we like with the color, and then we're going to come back to do the grain. Because whatever we pick here, we're going to repeat for each one of these layers. We're going to run each one of these, whether it's the knots, the knot backgrounds, or the actual background colors, are going to be run through exactly the same warp. So I want to get this squared away with the color before we start messing around with this stuff. And let's put something more in here. And now it's time for our gradient map. Let's just build a simple gradient. I'm not going to pick a gradient. I was going to actually go and pick a gradient off of some wood. I don't think we need to do that. We'll keep it simple. It's an ugly color. Something about this I don't like. One of them looks really green. It looks really green. Well, you get the idea. I obsess over these things. I can do these for hours. I think that's good enough for now. What's important is, do I like the flow of the pattern? And the answer to that, I think, is yes. So I'm happy with this warp. And that's kind of the thing I needed to establish right now, because I'm going to create this sort of background thing now. Well, it's not even background, it's more like the actual surface grain of the wood. I'm going to flatten this out. And then I think I'm going to use a screen. I just want something that's going to kind of just undulate this a little bit. Certainly not multiply. Let's lighten. Now, let's use a screen. And then I'm going to duplicate this warp, and I'm going to hook this thing up into it. Because whatever this does, I want this to do as well. We're going to repeat the process with the nodes that we are using for our, the rings that go around the knots. Sorry, losing my words there. Oh, you know what? First of all, that's not color. That is AO, and we're going to need to just temporarily at least put a white in that ambient occlusion. So we're ready now to start taking these masks that we've built and starting to actually build the material using these three separate sections. We've got the knots, we've got the knot background, and we've got the background. Okay, let's start with the color, because that is actually going to inform the normals and other stuff down the road. Because it's actually the efficient way of doing it. Because if I build the gradient map once, I can always turn into a grayscale and mess around with it, rather than making separate grayscale gradient maps for what we're doing up in here. So we'll start with the color, and then we'll work on down from that. We've got our background done. Let's duplicate this gradient map and see what happens if we put our rings in there. It's kind of close. I mean, I want it to you know, reflect the same colors. The knots are going to be a bit darker, so I am going to come into my gradient map and I am going to adjust it. But what it's going to let me do is kind of keep things in the same family. That'll do for now. And now that I've got this darker set of colors built, I'm going to duplicate this guy here. And I'm going to plug it into this background warp. And what this does is it just basically gives me a darker version of what's happening in the background. And this is going to be the color that we're going to use. There is that rougher section that outlines these guys. So we're going to have another little section that's going to get that rough area that is going along the X wherever we find a knot that we were looking at in the beginning. And that's what this is going to be. And we can start blending them. So I've got my knot here, and I'm going to put it over its rough background color here, and we're going to use one of these maps here. So let's try the blurred out one. Now, oh wait, no, we need to do this one because it's warped. So yeah, that looks pretty good. Maybe, I think, because we have to keep that warp the same, I think I'm going to put a levels node in here because I want to see a bit more of these. I think it's cutting them out just a bit too much. Well, you know what? Before I do that, I'll probably take care of it in here. I'll just see that one, and then I'm going to go to this levels node in here. Oh wait, you know what? No, we have to do it the other way because it's affecting the warp. So we have to do it this way. Okay. I can tell right away this is going to be so different from the wood I made before, but that's kind of the way with these, especially with these squiggly things that you do with gradient maps. So this right here is only talking about the background for the actual knot, and then like this background here is we're going to cut a lot of that out, and that's what we're going to do now. We're going to overlay it on our lighter background using another blend node, and we're going to cut that out. We're going to put this in the background, and then we're going to no, let's try this one. Again, we're going to probably put another levels node in here because I don't want to affect this gradient. So if I have to pull it out of this chain if I want to make a different mask with it. So you can see now that, you know, the darker areas are going to correspond to the, you know, the rougher texture and surface. I think we might want to lighten this up. I don't think I want it to be quite as dark as the, I mean, that mask is already, let's leave it until we get other stuff on there, because the way that this mask is made, there's a lot of grayscale, so, and that's how I want it. I want it to fade in and out. Let's take a look at that so far. Yeah, I think color-wise it's all right. All right, and then finally, we're going to make another one of these dark gradients. And we're going to get these little guys. Still got some artifacting going on there. You know, I'm going to take care of it in the gradient. Relatively simple because, you know, again, it's corresponding to a grayscale. So all I really need to do is take this thing and not double click on it and move it up until that square disappears. If I highlight this, it's going to turn it into the background if I drop it in like this, which is in this case what I want. And then we have the mask that is going to cover everything, because eventually we're going to put, no, you know what? I think let's use this mask first, because this mask only deals with this very outline here. And before we go any further, I think that there are too many rings in that knot. So I'm going to go into this gradient map, and I'm going to really simplify it. I think that matches better with the rings that we have. And again, I'm trying not to obsess about spending too much time over that. I mean, if you're going to, be making a nice material, I will easily spend a couple of hours just messing around with the gradient maps to get the color just right. And, we don't really need to do that here. So I'm just doing very basic colors just to show how to do it, but I think that matches better. We might change our mind once we see it with some bump on it, but for now, we'll leave it alone. Might also want to make it darker. I'm going to drop a hue saturation lightness node in here as well. And this way we can just darken it up just a bit. Okay, let's start applying some normals to everything. I'm going to get a grayscale node. So I'm going to get a couple of them. And I'm going to start turning these gradient maps into grayscales. So that is our background. I'm trying to keep the same order so that we can use the same mask setup and not confuse ourselves. So the next one we have is our sort of larger, chunkier rings that go around the exact, go around the knot. And that's that. And then we have the background, but I think we'll leave that for now. Let's just work with these two. So I'm going to get a levels node for each one of these. And let's see how we can make this better in terms of any normal maps that we make. Because this has converted it to grayscale, I do need to fix it because it's taking these darker colors, and I may not necessarily want these darker tones. But it's a relatively simple thing to fix in here. And that should give us something decent. And, oops, I think I did. I want the knots on top, and I want that in the background. And then what mask did we use here? We got this one. So let's see what kind of normal that gives us. I am off my notes. Oh, this is as much of a surprise to me as it is to you. But let's try height to normal. And let's take a look. Now this is going to be all chunky, so we haven't put in the smoother material in the back. But I'll be honest, I'm pretty happy with what I see here. We haven't put the knots on top yet either. Yeah, it's giving me the rougher, more broken up rings here, and then we've got the smoother rings here. I mean, this is the deep version of the smoother rings, so we'll be cutting that out next. But I think so far so good. I'm pretty happy with this. Okay, so next we laid it on top of the background. So that means we need, oh, you know what? I did it off the wrong one. It doesn't matter. I'll do two versions of the same one because this is giving me better colors as far as grayscales than this one. I've got a lot of different tones here. This is a much more even tone, and it's going to let me control it better using a levels node. So I'm going to take this same one, and I'm going to just make another height to normal off of it. And I'm just going to set it down to a much lower height. And then we can repeat this thing here. So this is our rings around here in the darker wood. And we just substitute. So the background is going to be the smoother wood. The foreground is going to be the rougher. And then we use this mask. And that smoothed things out. So we've got this horizontal area next to where the knots are is going to, is higher in its normals than the stuff in the background. We can adjust it a bit more. I think it could probably be a little smoother, maybe. There's a bit more contrast. That. But again, adjust it to suit. But we're starting to get some variation in the normals, which is really what I wanted. So the next thing I want to take care of is you know, the perfect smoothness that's going on here as far as the normals are concerned. I mean, it's super shiny, yeah, but it's also like super duper smooth. So the knots are, you know, they're bumpy, but doesn't have that grain to it. And that's where this stuff comes in. And that's why we're warping it against the same stuff. And let's just use a regular normal. I don't think we need a height to normal for that because it's pretty shallow. And let's just lay it on top and see what it does, because like I said, I'm experimenting just as much as you are now. I want a different size over this, but I just want to see what my baseline is, and then we can decide what we want to do with it. So we're going to overlay this. Yeah, and I think I'm pretty happy with it as far as the, you know, the smooth wood. You know, I think I don't want to run it through this. I think I'm going to do it straight like this because I want to see it everywhere. And I think this noise has enough undulation in itself that it kind of takes care of that, and I don't need to sort of white areas out here. But I do need to tone it down. So we'll delete that. We'll get back to our normal, and we will bring that back down again. Maybe something more like that. And it's giving us some nice little rings in there. I'm liking it. I'm liking it. But I want to make a rougher version for here. So we'll kind of do the same thing as we did here. We'll do them in the same order. We'll get a blend. And we have currently the knots on top and this below. I think I'm going to, because it's all warped, I'm going to do them off the same one. We will get a levels node in here. I don't want to change the size because it's I mean, I can change this. If I change the size back here and run it through a warp again, we could do it. But I just as soon not. And, you know, let's not do them if we don't have to. So let's try it with the levels node first. And we're going to cut it out using the same mask that we used for this. Oh, wait, no, we're going to cut it out using the same mask that we used for this, so this guy. Alright, so that is currently the same. I'm going to get another levels node in here because we're going to have to manipulate both of them because I'm going to want to set this back up high again because that will be my rougher normal. And I can make it more contrasty, which will kind of change its shape. And then my smoother one, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to try to tone it down a little bit. So even though they're using the higher normal setting, I'm taking care of it in my levels node instead. So now I've got two different sort of levels of normal, but they're both doing the same thing. And that's what it's supposed to do because, you know, it's the same piece of wood. It's just rougher here than it is there. So that's dealt with everything except for the actual knots. And I forget, do I have my height set in here? I just want to make sure I have my tiling set to 2 and I have my height scale set to 1. That is where I want it. So now it's time to apply our knots. And like I said, I'm off my notes, so I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to see what happens if I do end up using my normal out of here, just to see what it looks like. Yeah, I think I will use it. Right, so that covers the entire thing. But we have to actually also apply these guys. So I'm going to get another height to normal, and I'm going to take the actual ring system of the knot. I'm going to create a normal for it, and then I'm going to blend it with this guy. So, you know what? Let's just get another blend node. It doesn't want to do that. I'm going to have to go all the way back here. And we're just going to use an overlay blend. and that gives us the knot. And that's what we put in there. And it's bumping it up now to 2K for us, which is what I want to see happen. And the reason it's doing that is there's nothing in here. So I have to make sure that whatever I plug into my background is either at parent size, or I have to change this node. Oh, you know what? We forgot to change all of this. Wow, this looks really good at 512, because that's what's coming out of here. Okay, let's go back and get these gradient maps to be relative to parent. Because what I said we were going to do in the beginning, I never did. And we have, okay, so everything else is coming out of this node. We are making our normals from our color, so that is also, the inputs are okay here. This one right here, because it's coming directly from the mask, needs to get converted to parent. And I think that should be it. Yeah. Oh, what am I doing? I want to put it on top of this guy. Threw myself off there. That looks pretty good. We need to work on the heights. We need to work on the roughnesses, but I think for the most part, I'm pretty happy with it. Try to get this to sort of be a little bit smaller. I can't, it's kind of hard to even make frames on this one because it is daisy chaining out like this. In this particular case, it was the most efficient way of making it. So there we are. And next we're going to start working the roughness and the other surfaces. Before we do that, let's quickly sort out our ambient occlusion, because all I'm going to do is take it right off of this normal map right here. So we've got normal to height, and then we'll also get an ambient occlusion. And we'll plug that in there. And let's try to make that a little bit more efficient. We can reduce the height depth because we really don't need it that high. We can lower down the radius a little bit. I guess that doesn't really help. We'll leave that alone, but we definitely want to optimize the GPU. And that will absolutely do the trick. And we can plug that into our ambient occlusion. And so now we've got that hooked up. If you want to fool around with it a little bit, you can make it a little deeper or a little less deep. That's pretty good. Now, since I'm not on my notes, we're going to have to take a look and see what we got here and how we are going to take care of our height and our roughness. The height. We want this to be the highest, this to be the next highest, and the rest of it to be in the background. What I'm gonna do this artificially, because all of the, the various tones that we have going on here, we're using it for color and for normal, but I don't want all of that information in there. I want my heights to be much flatter. That being said, I don't want them entirely flat either. So we're going to have to take some of these more contrasty nodes here and kind of flatten them out a bit. But we're going to build them according to the masks that we're going to need. So let's set up our blends first. The first thing we want to do, we're going to have this one represent the height of the knot itself, and then we're going to have this one represent the height of this area here. And to do that, we want the mask that is going to cover the entirety of this knot right here. So that's the one we want. And we're going to, I think, just go ahead and use the height straight from here. And we're going to put that on top of a height for this. Now, I don't want to use a flat color. Let's see what we get. That's not the right one. Here it is. So we've got a grayscale version of that here. Yeah, we could make that work. Let's plug this one in here and then take a look at what's going on here. So this is the height we wanted. Now, at its base, there is, you know, this gray tone right here. So ideally, we want what's happening in these rings here to be slightly darker than this. In fact, you know what? Let's see whether we can't get, I'm going to see whether I can't drop these back a little bit more. That just makes that a little bit darker down at the bottom. Now I'm going to switch down to this one, and I'm going to start to try to match up the heights. I think probably like this. Now let's flatten it out a little bit first. So there will be some variation in it, but it's not nearly, you know, it's sticking pretty much within these middle grays, and then we can take the whole thing and darken it down. There. So it's now more or less at the same level as this edge right there. So that means that it's going to, this will be the highest point, and then it's going to slope down, and it's going to hit this area. It'll do a little bit of undulation that'll, you know, match that normal map, but that's that bit done. Then we're going to get another blend node, and we are going to use, let's think about this. What kind of masks do we have? I think we'll just go ahead and use the exact same mask that we put the rougher wood on with. So this is the grayscale that we used for all of that. Let's just grab up one of those. Now the trick is finding the mask. That's, I believe, the mask. Yeah, wait, it's the stretched out one. This is the mask right here. Okay. And this is why I like to put labels on things, so I don't have to hunt around for stuff. Okay, I'm just going to duplicate this. No, I'm not. I'm going to grab a new one. That has to be higher. So I think I'm going to put this one in there. We may or may not need that levels node. I just realized that this is at 512. We need to make this relative to parent. So I don't like the way this is cutting out. I'm going to add that levels node after all. And I'm going to darken this down so I can see the difference. And I'm going to make this a bit more contrasty, because I kind of want that rough area to be slightly higher, but now I'm not liking this bit. I want this a bit lighter. Actually, I should probably look at it on this last one. So I'm single clicking on that, and let's bring that up just a bit more. So we kind of have these different zones. This is like the flat part of the wood. Then it kind of rises up, and then you have the nobules on top. Let's see how that works. That looks all right. We can draw a box around this. Well, I think we're going to copy this pretty much exactly. And get rid of this one first. And we're going to do some changes here, but the masks we're using are going to be the same. All right. So now we're talking about roughness. The bits that are the highest, I want to have ever so slightly shinier than the bits that are deeper. And that means I'm going to need an invert. So we'll get an invert grayscale. And I'm not going to use this bevel. I'm going to take a look and see what my normal maps look like, because we might be able to save a couple of steps. I think we could probably use this one to do, you know, this whole rougher wood area. So I don't think we're going to need to split that up. Right, let's convert that to a height map. I'll use the HQ. And then we'll take this grayscale we created and we'll invert it. So at this point, the bits that are highest are reading black and the bits that are lowest are reading white. And then we'll plug that into this levels node. We don't really need this, I think. I think we're going to plug this straight into here, because that is dealing with this entire thing. And then we're just looking at this now. Get rid of these two. And let's plug it in and see what it actually looks like. Okay. Let's start with our rough areas. Really hard to do with just the one screen. So we're getting some shinier bits up here. And then as it goes lower, it gets a little less shiny. Don't worry about these knots. We're going to take care of them at the end, because those have to be rougher. But these rings here and this intermediate wood, I think I'm satisfied with that. And then we can come into this levels node, and we will make the whole thing less shiny. So, you know, you can fool around with that, but I think that's pretty good right now. And now what we need to do is we need to add on our knots. So let's find something where we have our knots. These guys. Yeah, that's, I don't know where that's coming from. I mean, we're getting around it because we've got the masks. It's not really bothering me. I'm just curious where I got that artifacting from. Let's get another normal to height. Oh, wrong one. And we'll get another invert. And another levels. And I'm going to highlight that node. That's the one right here. And we'll replace that. And now we can adjust just that area. Oh, wrong direction. Yeah. There's one thing left to do. I'm seeing a line here. We're going to have to come back and fix that, but there's something else I want to do before then. And that is, this whole area is very smooth. I mean, I like what's happening here with the grain. I want to take the area that we've, you know, this whole horizontal band that we've designated as rougher, and I want to roughen it up just a little bit more than we had it, you know, than the rest of the wood. So to do that, we need to find something to rough it up with. And I think I'm going to use this, that directional noise that we used for, you know, the grain. I'm going to get a height to normal, and I'm going to get a transform, and I'm going to make this bigger. So we'll double it. It shouldn't affect our, at least I hope it's not going to affect. You see, I created a line here. That's the problem with doing this. I don't think we're going to have enough of it that it's going to make a difference, but we may have to come up with a different plan. In fact, maybe we should come up with a different plan right now. Let's use this instead. We're going to want it smaller though, because this is not going to give us that line. So let's get rid of this one. And let's see if we can't get away with not running it through another one of these warp nodes. I'm going to keep it back here for a while, just in case I do. Right, so we're going to need to blend this on top of everything that we've done so far. And the mask that we're going to use, we're going to use a version of this. And we'll make it an overlay. Yeah, it looks too straight. Let's warp it. And take this exact same warp that we've been using for everything else. I'm going to duplicate it. That's better. I think a little less warpy. But if we don't have a warp at all, it's like super straight. So I'm just trying to get rid of some of that. And we want to do it according to what we've been doing all along. I'm going to see what happens if I stick a sharpen node in here. I think I like that better. But that's pretty much it. Let's see if we can't organize this a little bit. This is crazy. This is such a mess. And I really don't like it when, well, I mean, we can. Let's try to organize it a little bit better now that we're kind of done with it. Let's get all our colors together. This is our masks that we're using. So we can call this color. And we'll classify this as a mask. These will be masks. I kind of like to keep my masks together. This is also masks. That's a little better. Okay, let's take it for a test drive. We'll publish it out to the player. I just want to make sure all my things are hooked up. We can take a look to see not location. Yep, those are hooked up in here. Not size. They are hooked up in here. We look like we're ready to go. So we'll come into our Explorer. We'll click on Knotty Wood. We'll publish it out. And then we can switch over to the player. So I just want to make sure that I had the height set up in here. Yeah, okay. I'm going to just pull that in there so we have more to look at. And let's open up the material we just made. It's pretty good. It'll look even better if it's at 2K. And we can take a look on the cylinder. I think it looks better on a cylinder. Oh yeah, the one thing we wanted to do, we need to take care of that line right there. So let's come back to substance. And I think this looks okay. I think it's probably in the warps. And which one is it? I think it's the little one. It's the one we have little right now. Yeah, it's the one that we have small right now. So that is this guy. So let's bring down this warp just a little bit and see if that helps. No, it's not there. Our problem is someplace else. Let me take a break and I'll find it and I'll get back to you guys. All right, this is the node right here. This line right here. That's it there. So I'm pretty sure this directional blur will have something to do with it. Yep, there we go. That should fix it. Yeah, it's still pretty straight. Oh, you know what? We're in for penny, in for pound. Let's see what happens if... Okay, I could take these all up and move them onto that warp, but I'm not going to do that because if I don't like it, I'll never be able to get it back. I'm going to duplicate this warp and see whether I don't like it better with the warp. because if, you know, if we got to add the warp, we got to add the warp, because I'm not really keen on how straight those are either. And again, it's going to be like a really small amount. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's why it's not working. So it's that final levels node. So instead of having it come straight out of this levels, we're going to warp it also. I think I like that better. It was kind of, it kind of looked, you know, there were like these shadows on the outside. I think that's better. Let's publish it out again. And refresh it. Yeah. You know, you can adjust them to how you want them. I mean, I think maybe now a little bit, yeah, we're still getting that roughness into there. I think that's fine. Again, you know, this is, everybody's wood is going to look different. But that's the basic idea. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope you've learned something new, and I'll see you in the next video.